Welcome to another month of Technical Assistance Live, TA Live. We're happy to have you here with us. Our topic today is how to work with an interpreter, and we are joined today with Jennifer Francisco from the Educational Interpreter Project. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her. Go ahead, Jennifer. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for the welcome. And thank you very much for coming to the workshop today. I appreciate seeing everybody. I've had, such a busy week and there have been so many things happening. So I'm really glad that you came. My project as Educational Interpreter Project is the IDEA state funded project under the Florida Department of Education. And I am focused on K through 12 interpreters and agency interpreters who are placing their interpreters into the K through 12 setting. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. If you have any questions or if you want to engage with me, please type that into the chat, and then we will either copy what you say from the chat box or I will call for a spotlight to have you come in and we can then speak to each other in sign. So my project mission has a mission and vision my project has a mission and vision statement. I'd like to show that to you here on the first slide. So I give you a second to take a look at that. Thank you, Sherry, for that. Appreciate it. So this is from my project website. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. So we want to talk to you a little bit about the role of the educational interpreter and the agency's interpreters. When I'm talking about educational interpreter, I'm talking about both of them. I'm going to say educational interpreter, but it's the interpreter in an educational setting, despite whether being regular staff or coming in as a freelance interpreter. So I wanted to talk about their role, and it's a critical role, and what their job responsibilities actually are. There's a lot of confusion about what the interpreter should actually be doing or should not be doing, right? The main role is to facilitate communication and access for the deaf and hard of hearing students in the classroom and in the school setting. So the word school setting means clubs, school events, field trips, any situation that the student is going to be engaged in while at school is something that the interpreters need to think about. We don't need an interpreter for after school events, just in the day, right? Academically related, that's not necessarily, I mean, they have to have access to that, right? So the next role is successful communication, effective communication between the classroom, the student, and the instructor and the other students, lectures, activities, engagements, and even environmental noises. That interpreter is responsible to deliver that to the student because, you know, if this hearing student can hear it, the deaf student should be told about it. They should be able to see it, right? Even if it's not appropriate socially, right? Or disgusting. If everybody else has access, this deaf kid has the right to have access as well. So if something is like, well, they don't need to know about that. That's like not polite. That's not the interpreter's choice, right? They need to have access to all of that. They have to have choice if they want to see it, if they don't want to see it, right? And if you have a deaf student who doesn't realize that burping or passing gas is noisy, you need to let them know, we can hear that so that they can learn. Interpreters create visible access to materials, right? They use expansions. They don't always sign just the words they're hearing, but they sign the information that's being presented, right? So when you are introducing posters or information on the whiteboard, the interpreter will be using that as visual support for the interpretation that they're creating so that the deaf person will have visual access to everything. Having a whiteboard makes the interpreter's job easier because they can then reference what is their visual for everybody else. And then also, it allows the student to learn to use the room for access information and to find other information, supportive information, and not just rely on, I have to look at the interpreter the whole time, right? There's a lot of information in the classroom environment that they need to learn to access in order to be able to get the information. And the interpreter is supplementing and supporting that. We also want to empower the students to be able to participate in class discussions and class activities and, conversations with their peers. And I put the word conversation in there intentionally because it's super important for the students to be able to be included in their social setting, right? That is, conversation is happening all over the place all the time. And those deaf kids need to be aware that those conversations are happening, even if it's not their conversation, right? That helps you develop emotional skills. If they don't know how to socialize, then they are going to have a bigger disability when they get out into the world dealing with adults. Sometimes hearing staff members will say, oh, the student doesn't need to hear about that, or don't tell them about this. The interpreter must say, my job is to deliver everything, right? So everything the hearing kids hear, these deaf kids need to see. If the teachers or the adult does not want the student to see or hear this, then they need to do that in a place that is separate from the deaf student so that they can't see or hear it. Interpreters are also responsible for providing more time for the deaf student to be able to process the information that is being taught to them. We often forget that deaf children are trying to process two languages at the same time, right? We have this print English language, we have this signed ASL language, and they're trying to do that going back and forth and back and forth. If we don't give them enough time, they're not going to have enough time to actually comprehend, which leads to retention. And if they don't retain, if they don't comprehend, they're not going to be able to participate in further discussions. Interpreters also have to maintain confidentiality. They have to follow the professional code of conduct. And for under the RID, the National Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, and the NATE, the National Association of Interpreters in Education. They also have a professional code of conduct. But the NATE is focusing on K through 12 code of conduct, and then we have the national CPC as well for general code of conduct amongst adults. So now I want to talk about responsibility, right? The role is related to engagement and how the interpreter can be effective in the classroom. What are their responsibilities in the classroom? How they are engaging. This doesn't have anything to do with the student. This has to do with what the interpreter should be doing and how they're managing themselves. So collaborating with staff members is important. The goal is to assure that the deaf student is getting adequate access to the instruction. So that means, are they getting visual access to the information that's being presented? Are they getting enough information to be able to understand, or are the interpreters getting enough information to be able to understand what's being taught so they can deliver that to the student? If the interpreter is missing it, the student is going to be missing it, right? So we need to figure out how to make sure that the delivery of the information is adequate so the interpreter can deliver that to the student so the student doesn't miss information, right? The interpreter is responsible for facilitating that kind of communication, and the interpreter has to have access to it. So interpreters, this is one of my pet peeves with interpreters is interpreters are like, I just interpret PSE. That's I don't have to worry about that. ASL, or some interpreters are like, I only do ASL. I only do ASL. That is not what interpreter needs to be focusing on in K through 12. The interpreter needs to be focusing on the language that the student most readily comprehends, right? There are some interpreters that the interpreters need to be able to code switch according to each individual student, right? And they also say, deaf and hard of hearing students are not one size fits all. That's a fact, right? You can't come in as an interpreter and assume that your one style is going to fit all of these deaf students, right? If you notice the deaf student is struggling, you have, as the interpreter, have to modify what you are delivering in order to be able to bring them into the communication effectively. So interpreters should have a good understanding of the educational practices. They should understand the curriculum and how assessments are being produced. This is super important. I always say, could somebody just show up and do something that they don't know anything about, or something they've never experienced before? Just walk into a complex skilled job and just do it. That's not something that's reasonable. If you're a doctor, let's say a doctor decides to become a vet, so they show up at a veterinary clinic and they say, I'm going to go ahead and do veterinary medicine now. Oh, I'm sorry. That would be a little bit scary, because I wouldn't want to take my dog to that kind of a person, right? Same thing with an interpreter. The interpreter needs to have an understanding of the curriculum, an understanding of the expectations, an understanding of how teaching happens, how students learn, so that they can match their product to this student toward the goals that the teacher has for the student, right? Assessments is a hot topic right now in deaf education. I'm sure that you are all aware, but the interpreter should be prepared for the assessment, right? If they know an assessment is coming up, they should try to contact the administration. They should see if there's anything that needs to be done for accessibility. They should have a copy of the materials to review prior to the need to interpret for that test. If the Florida State Department of Education happens to have a training, or if they're going to be talking about that, interpreters really should want to go and understand from the state what it is that is expected of them. Or the administration should send that interpreter to or they should send someone to those trainings who will then deliver that information to the interpreter. It is critical for student success that the interpreter understands how to process these assessments. And if the result of these assessments is such that if the students don't do well, that reflects on the students, the teacher, and the school. And that is something we have to keep in mind. These interpreters are responsible for accessing one student who eventually could reflect on the entire school if the interpreter is unprepared. So if their sharing information is successful, the interpreters will have much more knowledge about what they're dealing with, and they will be much better able to successfully do their job. So interpreters also should prep for lessons. If they, to know what the lesson plan is, they should contact the teacher and ask the teacher to share their notes or their lesson plans for the week. So that the interpreter would be able to review and study the concepts and the vocabulary. Maybe they don't remember it from when they were in school or something, but they need to walk in with as much information about this setting as the teacher walks in. If they walk in and they do not know what they're going to be interpreting for, their work is not going to work very well, and they're not going to make very much sense to the students. So we should not hold the interpreter responsible for not coming completely prepared if we don't give them access to the information they need to completely prepare. One example, if you don't know how to sign, I can give you an example. The word run, R-U-N, has more than 15 signs and meanings. If the interpreter is not prepared, they're going to pick the wrong sign for that word in context, and they're not and that's going to reflect negatively on how the student understands it, right? They're going to understand it fine. The student's going to learn something, but they're going to learn it wrong. And then we're going to have to go back and we're going to have to relearn and fix what was taught inadvertently. So we really want to make sure that interpreters know ahead of time, like what book we're going to be using, the introduction to the book. The interpreters make sure they have a copy of that. Make sure the interpreter have access to the curriculum. I know more and more curriculums are digital, they're online. Give the interpreter the password. Let them access the curriculum as if they were an instructor so that they could look at it. I mean, it doesn't cost any more money to give the interpreter access to something you're already paying for, right? If you give them access from home, they can also take notes and think about it while they're at home. And I've spoken with some schools that, the interpreter had no access, and I've asked them and they said, "Oh, we can give the interpreter access, no problem." You know, you just need to make sure that that the interpreters have access to this. So the school is paying for their licenses so they can easily give access to that license to the interpreters as needed. It's no loss. Another thing is that interpreters should be at school events. They should go on field trips. They're doing these extracurricular activities. The interpreters need to be willing to interpret because those students need access in those settings, right? And so the interpreter is expected to do these things. Unless you have a team of interpreters, they each will take turns being the one who leaves campus and goes out on these extra duties as assigned. But the interpreters need to know that that's part of their job. Do we have any questions? All right, good. So more responsibilities, facilitate communication between the instructors and the parents. We may have deaf parents who will come into the classroom, have a meeting. You need to have an interpreter for that. Or if the deaf or hard of hearing student is invited to the meeting, you're going to have an interpreter for that. But what I recommend is that you do not have the student's classroom interpreter interpreting for parent teacher conference meetings, right? If there's an IEP or a parent teacher meeting, the interpreter is there and that's their interpreter. They need to be a part of the meeting, not just working the meeting. So you need to have a neutral third party interpreter for those meetings for the deaf student. Also, there's advocacy that is needed for the student, right? So there should be the advocate should be, the word advocacy is something that students need to learn. They're very often coming into school or coming out of school. They do not know their rights. They do not know what an advocate is. They do not know that they have the right to that. So they should be able to, the interpreter should be able to teach these deaf students what an advocate is or how to self-advocate if they need to. So the student can't, if the student can't see the interpreter well while the teacher is talking because the teacher is walking in front of the interpreter, or the interpreter is placed far on the other side of the room, or there's light coming in the window behind the interpreter, the student should be able to be, if the interpreter says, if you can't see, raise your hand. Tell the teacher what's happening that's not working for you, right? It's really hard for these students at first because deaf and hard of hearing students don't want to be problematic. They don't want to be seen as a problem. They don't want to be noticed. But the interpreter's responsibility is to teach those children that their rights are to be able to make sure that they have access to the interpreter, to the communication. There could be a lot of things that you would have to advocate for as a deaf student. That you need to move your seating. There's no captioning on the videos. Somebody should be able to say, I need captioning. So often the deaf student will ask the interpreter, and the interpreter is like, should give it back to the student. Raise your hand, ask the instructor, use the interpreter to ask for your needs so that these kids learn when they go out into the world as an adult, they have the competency to be able to bring these questions to the hearing person. You know, their ability to advocate for themselves determines how successful they will be in their life in the adult world, right? If they don't have those skills, they're going to be a little lost and they're just going to get railroaded when they go out into the world as an adult. So another hot topic is the IEP team and meetings. I know not all of the districts have sufficient interpreters or even any interpreters, but the interpreters who work regularly with this student, that interpreter should be in the IEP meeting, right? Those interpreters are considered regular service facilitators. That means they should be part of the IEP team meeting. They are part of the IEP team. They need to be in that meeting to deliver feedback, to ask questions, to hear what other people are saying. Their goal is to be able to satisfy the needs of the student effectively. And without that information, it's harder for them to do their job, right? If somebody says, oh, this is the teacher's job or this is the case manager's job to relay notes to the interpreter, they don't really have to come. That's not true. They need to be there. They might not need to answer any specific questions, but they are an integral part of this team. They are not separate and they should not be kept separate. They should be there and they should be actively involved. Sometimes there will be an input form for the interpreter to fill out. If they're unable to attend the meeting, they still need to fill out input. The case manager will be able to review with the interpreter what their concerns are or what their questions are, and then can bring that to the meeting without the interpreter. But preferably the interpreter should be there. The interpreter should participate in professional development and continue to improve their skills and their knowledge regarding interpreting and deaf education. ASL and deaf education, the fields, both of those fields are changing continuously, right? You can't ever reach a point in either of those areas where you say, I got it, I don't need to do anything more, right? This is called lifelong learning. You have to continuously improve, continuously to seek to improve. And it's like teachers are expected to earn credits to maintain their certification. And in the same way, interpreters should be expected to have continuing education credits. Schools should provide free workshops for non-student professional days. My project can provide free workshops for your staff and the agency interpreters as well. If they're used in K through 12 and they're interested in coming for extra education, we're totally open to having them. So interpreters should expand and explain, clarify vocabulary, right? And sometimes teachers become concerned that because the interpreter is appearing to explain things, they're actually taking something away from the teacher. But the fact is that the languages are very different. And those linguistic expansions are important because not all of the deaf students have background knowledge that brings them into the reference to the word in the same way as a hearing person might hear that word. So without that expansion, and I promise you, teachers, I promise you, the interpreters are not intentionally giving any answers away, right? But it seems like sometimes the interpreters might still be signing when the instructor has stopped. Trust me, they're still working. They're still saying what you said. There's a lag time where the interpreter has processed the information in English And then they start delivering that information in ASL, and that's when they start to interpret. And the time between I've received the information to the time I've delivered the information is called the lag time. That is ensuring that little bit of over continuous interpreting after the teacher has stopped talking is proving that they are actually doing their job correctly. So, how to work with an educational interpreter? Teachers, staff members, should have weekly staff meetings with the interpreters. They should meet during their planning meeting or after school. The staff members should, work with the interpreter asking, do you notice anything about the student? Is there anything that I need to do to make your job easier? Maybe is there anything that you, interpreter, notice about the student that I might need to know to make teaching this student more effective? Because many times the student gets overlooked by the instructor. The instructor thinks because they're sitting there quietly, they're probably fine. But fact is they're completely lost. And the teacher doesn't know that, but the interpreter does. If there are no meetings, no communication between the instructors and the interpreter, how do you know that the student is getting behind or having a hard time with a topic or falling behind? If there's, I mean, it doesn't have to be a 20-minute meeting. It can be 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be long, just short enough to be able to say, hey, next week your activities, the interpreter can say next week, what are the activities so that I can prep? And the teacher can say, how's the student doing? What do you think about, how this is going? And is there anything that needs to change? So staff members should email the interpreter a copy of the lesson plans, the books, the activities, so the interpreters have all of the information they need to review, to check references, to look at the curriculum, to understand what is expected. Once they understand what's expected, it's much easier to deliver an interpretation. For example, in a math class, math today is taught very differently than it was 10 years ago, right? The interpreters need to have an understanding of what's going to be shown in the classroom instead of an interpreter who did this 10 years ago and comes in now. It's going to be a completely different experience. So if the interpreter is given access to the information, they can see how the math is going to be taught, they can read it. It's going to make it easier for them to interpret more effectively. And as I said before, give them access to the digital curriculum planner. I mean, I believe they should have everything is online now, everything is digital. So it should not be, oh, I'm so sorry, we don't have that ready, or oh, I'm so sorry, I give you access, I'll make copies. It's like everything's digital. Just give them a password, give them a link, right? Let them have access. And sometimes staff people are like, when interpreters are here to watch me, or they're here to see how I teach and make judgments. Let me tell you something, trust me. Interpreters don't have time to be assessing the effectiveness of the teacher. This is just not what they do. They're looking at this student and they're looking at this information and they're saying, how do we get this information to the student? That job is not easy. I mean, they're not there to pull you down, right? Their job is to make sure that that student has the information they need to be able to succeed. Also, let the interpreter have enough time to process the information, right? In order to interpret, they are processing two languages simultaneously, as well as the student is, right? So yes, they're trained. It should be, fairly effective. But you have to make sure that they have enough time to facilitate the information well and accurately to the student, right? If they're not getting accurate information, it means the student is learning it wrong. So what goes in is going to stay there. The deaf student's not going to know that they learned something wrong. And so there's an issue when the interpreter then has to go back and try to fix it, or the teacher has to go back and try to fix it. It's almost impossible to fix something that once it's been put in there, right? Because these are concept developments that's happening in the educational setting. try to use as much visual aids and visual materials in the classroom as you can, right? So, for example, when talking about science and plant cells, instead of forcing the interpreter to try to interpret the construction of a cell, have a picture on the board or a poster or something so that the interpreter can go up and point at the references that you're making. Way easier to teach the anatomy of a cell by pointing at the words labeling the parts than it is to try to figure out how to create an image like that, right? I know it feels strange, like Vanna White is going to come up and start pointing at things, but it is much more efficient for the deaf student who's learning these terms to be able to see the terms in relationship to what you're talking about. So it's not just for the deaf and hard of hearing students' benefit, but it's also for the hearing students' benefit, right? Because they'll see the interpreter up there interacting with that poster. They'll be following what the teacher is saying while the interpreter is pointing at things. Everything is more accessible to everybody, right? Science Bank is a free materials website that many teachers and staff members can go and check this out. They can check out the materials and use them for free, right? It has plant cell 3D. There are animal cells, 3D animal cells. There are frog dissections or eye dissections, and they're ready, right? The teachers can go and check that out, borrow the three-dimensional object, use it to teach, and then return it. It's a great plan. So, do we have any questions so far? Okay, thank you, Candace. She posted the link. So, if you feel a little anxious or uncertain about these ideas, I'm always here to provide support. Please contact me. My job is to provide you support, to provide you tips to make things easier and make it easier to and more effective to work with the interpreters that we have to work with. Okay? What you should not do with an educational interpreter. Don't say, don't do that. Don't tell them that. Don't worry about that. That is called deprivation, right? That is depriving that deaf student of access. When you tell the interpreter not to do their job, you are basically saying this deaf person doesn't have the right to have the information that everybody else in the room has, right? If you say nobody in the classroom is going to get it, then nobody in the classroom should get it. But if everybody in the classroom gets it, then the deaf student should also get it. Do not walk in front of the interpreter. Do not block their line of sight. I understand teachers might not realize or might not be aware at first how much they move around while they're teaching, but crossing between the deaf person and an interpreter is totally inappropriate. The interpreter can teach the deaf person to tell the teacher that perhaps they should walk around the other way. The interpreter can, get the teacher's attention, maybe help them walk the other way. But you should have it in your mind that your goal is not to walk between the working interpreter and the deaf student. Don't excuse the interpreter. Don't disallow the interpreter from being a part of the IEP team. This is part of legal documentation in that IEP. We need to honor that presence of that interpreter. And any staff related services, any service providers should be in the IEP meeting. And the interpreter is a service provider, right? Anytime they say no is if the parents say, I do not want that interpreter at the meeting. Okay, if the parents don't want them, that's fine. But the case manager can say, but the case manager themselves cannot make that determination. What is super important is for the case manager to email the interpreter maybe 1 or 2 months early, put down the date. It could be a temporary date, but for now, put this down, be aware that this is coming up so that the interpreter is aware that an IEP is coming up and they are prepared to move things around to be able to be available for it. It does not hurt the students at all. It actually improves their access in school, improves their access to education, and improves their experience in the IEP. So the last thing that you don't do is don't expect the interpreter to teach. Don't expect the interpreter to educate these students. The interpreters are not certified teachers, right? They are certified interpreters or they are credentialed interpreters, but don't say just review that with the student. It's much easier for you to communicate than it is for me. But that interpreter is their right to say, I am not a certified teacher. I cannot teach this student. Unfortunately, there are some interpreters who will say, okay, but technically that is against the code of conduct. They are not qualified to teach and they should not be teaching. And how will the teacher know what is being taught? How will the teacher know if the student is even learning anything? If the interpreter is just going for it and the teacher doesn't know what's being gone after, right? So, are there areas that need to be reviewed? The teacher needs to be willing at times to work with that student one-on-one to make sure that the student is keeping up with what they expect the class is learning. This is my favorite part. Here, some districts feel, I don't know, but we have to talk about the ugly and the tough things too, right? So, educational interpreters can take a test called Educational Interpreter Performance Examination Assessment, EIPA. That assessment is specialized in assessing the effectiveness of educational interpreters K through 12. The interpreters should take the assessment to know what level of effectiveness they are working at. The district needs to know their EIPA, what kind of qualifications they've got working with this particular deaf student. Those qualifications have a direct impact on how effectively they are able to work with those deaf students. There is a direct correlation between the interpreter's EIPA score and the quantity of information that is being accurately delivered while in the classroom. So I will show you on the next slide some of the statistics about the quantity, right? But right now, I just wanted to talk about the quality for a minute, right? How the information is being passed on to the student, right? The higher the score in the EIPA, the more qualified and the more quantity and quality of information is being transmitted by that particular interpreter. So if you look at the chart that I have here on the screen, you'll see this gray line that says 0 to 2.4. That means the student is receiving exactly zero amount of information with that interpreter. Now, the interpreter is moving around a lot, but they're garbled, they don't make sense, they don't have good structure, they're not using appropriate signs, they're not able to keep up, the content is incorrect, they don't understand what they're trying to interpret. It's basically the deaf student is watching someone flap their hands around and making signs randomly, and the content, the purpose of the message is completely gone. Zero, right? If you move up the line to 2.5 to 2.9, right? The orange color, that's 1/3, maybe 30 to less than 50% of the information is being received by the student. Okay, so the student's getting something, but it's less than half of what the teacher is teaching. That is a deprivation, right? And then they're trying to get this information without good basis for language originally. They're trying to get this information without having had background information sufficient to be able to support the lesson plan. So all of these three things together, interpreter problems, language problems, and no background information, means they're not getting anything. So then if you take a look at the yellow bar, you got 3.0 to 3.4. That's 50 to 60%. That's like not enough information. You need these kids to get information. Think about yourself going into a classroom and you're only going to get 50% of what the teacher is teaching. Are you then going to be able to pass a test? Are you going to be able to, look at the district statewide assessment? I myself, I think if I only had access to 50%, there's no way. There's no way I would have a chance to pass that test, right? They're struggling to comprehend information and their scores are showing that, not all interpreters, but some interpreters. And this 50%, 50 to 60% is, marginally sufficient. So moving up to 3.5 to 3.9, you get 60 to 79% of the information. This is something of an improvement, but in my opinion, it's still not as much as you would expect, right? Some parents say, but 3.9 is fine. Really? I mean, really, are you okay with 75% of the information that's being taught in the class? Would you be willing to live with that, right? So if you look at the blue bar, 4.0 to 5.0 gives you 80 to 100%. This is not perfect. 80%. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with 80%, and that's with a 4 to 5 interpreter. It's really hard to get 100% because you have to work continuously. But it's possible. It is possible. So that's why the EIPA scores of 4.0 and up are considered adequately qualified to interpret effectively and appropriately in the K through 12 setting. The one nice thing about the EIPA test is that anybody who takes that test receives 4 to 5 pages of feedback on their product, right? So it looks at their signing strengths, their voicing, their vocabulary, their finger spelling. It is great feedback. It talks about each area that is required for effective interpreting and gives them feedback specific to each of those areas. Compared to the NIC, the National Registry of Interpreters test, that's a community interpreter, but anybody can take it. And the NIC does not provide any feedback about any part of their interpreting. So those interpreters don't know what to work on. They don't know what they need to improve on. The EIPA is very, very good in helping you continuously improve your product. My project also offers stipends to help cover half the cost of the EIPA test. And we also offer mentorships which help you work on your goals before you take that test, right? So mentorships are free, just putting that out there. Now, I want to show you what it looks like when you have a 3.0 to 3.4 score, right? If you look at the paragraph on the left, you have all of the information. And that is what is being taught, that is what is being spoken. If you look at the paragraph on the right with the blocked out text, that is 50% of the information missing. I'm going to give you just a minute to take a look at that and see how much of the left do you understand when reading the right. And then think about, read the right first and see what you get, and then read the left and think about what's the difference between that experience. So just as a person, would any of you be okay with this, 50 to 60% of the information presented? Would you be willing to accept that for your own children? They'll figure it out. Heck no, right? I want a qualified interpreter in there to give my kid the best opportunity they have to be able to get the information. So it's, many people say, oh, it's okay for these deaf kids, but would this be okay for your kid? It's not okay for your kid, right? Deaf kids, and they come in with difficulties anyway. They come in with less language exposure when they're young. They have language deprivation. They get no language exposure when they're outside of the school setting. And then when they are in the school setting, they get access to 50 to 59% of the information. We can't expect that to be effective. So now I'm going to show you what a 4.0 to 5.0 looks like. Take a minute to see that. What do you notice that's different between the last one and this one? Vocabulary. And less omissions, less errors, and less work required for the student to try to figure out what's actually going on. They have less difficulty trying to figure out how to fill in the blanks, right? More languages there, which will allow them to try to get through this experience without missing as much as possible. With this much information, they should be able to move through the process, at least realize when they missed something. And also with the previous 3.0 to 3.4, the interpreter was feeling overwhelmed. They were feeling like they weren't interpreting well. They were feeling like they weren't understanding what they were interpreting. You know, I call it, they were word vomiting, right? And they were hoping some of it will stick, and they were hoping they will understand something. That should not be the interpreter's goal, that constant pray, hope and a prayer, right? You want to give these deaf kids as much access as they can, and you want to give the interpreters the ability to feel like they can do the job. And with a 4.0 to 5, you've got something going. So I'm going to give you some time to ask questions. Oh, first, I have 3 links that I've included here. My project link, the NAIE Code of Ethics, and the guidelines, the National Association for Educational Guidelines, how interpreters should function appropriately when they're in the classroom and when they're doing their job. These guidelines are really cool. You can go to this link, you can download these guidelines, print them, and just have them. They're free. You don't have to pay to have access to this. And they're just really nice bits of information to have ready. All right, cool. Let me see if there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing. See if I can see everybody. Does anybody have any questions? I know this was a lot of information.
Hold on,
I
Beth.
actually
I see
do
you.
have
Yep.
one.
Go ahead.
So, which a little bit of a forefront. I am not in Florida anymore, so I'm actually in Oklahoma. So we are trying to prep for, of course, state testing. And the interpreter, she's like, "Oh, good luck getting the test prior to." And I was like, "Well, I'm going to push for it." So, um, any advice on how I could, any wording on how I could try to persuade our State Department to give us the test, an extra copy of the test, and the test ahead of time?
Yes, yes, yes. Data, you know, if the school wants good data and to provide access, and also, you know, when with deaf educators, my school administration, the administrators who were in control of the test, I asked for access and they said okay, but that access needed to stay in the office. So they were not going to give a copy of the test to the interpreter off site, but those interpreters can come in, they can be in the office, and often the administration the interpreters will say no, but the fact is that they were given the opportunity, right? If they don't take the opportunity as a part of their job, then that's on them. My goal is to provide equal access, not sufficient access, not meh, you know, flying by the seat of your pants access. I want adequate access. So those interpreters need to have information, they need to have accurate information. And so you can show your administration this is what interpreters need in order to be able to do their job. You don't have to break any confidentiality rules, but those interpreters need to have access to this in order to be able to adequately prepare. You know, you are more than welcome to contact me offline, and we can talk about this more if you need support. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Everybody's so quiet. Jennifer, I am not shy. Jennifer, I am not shy either. We are Jennifer, not shy. Okay. Also, I just want to put out there that your district, staff members, administration, they are not alone. There are lots and lots of opportunities. RMTC, DHH, my project, all of these projects are there to support you because everybody's goal is the same. We want these kids to be successful, right? That's the whole point of education. It's not about us. We already have a job, right? It's about them being able to grow up and be competent and able to get a job. And we need to give them equal access to their education as they're growing up. Amen, Jennifer say. So, last chance, people. Questions?
Jennifer, I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question.
Okay.
It's me. Yeah. So, what advice can you give schools or districts on the interpreter shortage? You know, we know there's a shortage. What advice can you give?
I have no advice. That is a battle all over the country, not just in Florida, right? There are not enough interpreters. So, I recommend districts contract with as many interpreter agencies as they possibly can to try to create a pipeline of interpreters that they can have access to. I have notes written down about this. The higher score an interpreter has, the pay should be higher, the EIPA score. They should be paid, adequate to their score. If we don't pay interpreters, then they need money to live and they're going to go to where the money is. We're not going to have them and they're going to go out in the world and make more money and they're going to do what they need to do, right? They have spent time and money on education and they have a big job when they come into our setting. I see interpreters getting paid equal to teachers. Interpreters have to deliver the information that the teachers are giving to the kids. So if they're not capable of doing that, then they're not capable.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Cool.
I saw someone put on their video, so I wasn't sure if they were waiting for a question or not. So
No,
okay.
I'm fine.
Okay.
Okay.
I have a quick thing
Awesome.
not a question, but just something I just want to point out. Hey, it's Anna Fernandez. I don't know if you can see me now. Hey.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I loved when you spoke about saying that the interpreter should also be at the IEP meeting. Like I like knowing that. Last year, I was still really fresh in this itinerant position and I didn't know all that. And like when the meeting happened, the interpreter wasn't there. But now knowing all this, I am going to fight for it a lot harder. Yeah, that's all. Just wanted to thank you for knowing that information.
Thank you so much. I think that that's great. And also, I tell all of the interpreters, you have the right to see the IEP. I mean, you're on the IEP. You should have access to read the IEP, know what the learning plans are, right? And I also suggest to interpreters to look at the annual date for the IEP, when it's due, when will be the next date, and put that on your calendar so that when it gets close to that time, to look for that meeting. right? Because sometimes they just don't say anything about it. And then hopefully you'll be too busy when the day gets established, right? So if you see the IEP, put that in your calendar, be ready the next year. Agency interpreters, regardless, if they're interpreting K through 12, they need to be invited to the IEP.
Mm-hmm.
Hey,
Awesome.
Jennifer, I do
Oh,
have another question.
hold on,
Um,
hold on, hold on, hold on. Okay, go ahead.
sorry, thank you so much. I do have another question. With regard to like virtual interpreters, we're seeing a lot of districts utilize virtual interpreters now. Does your project support those virtual interpreters, and what kind of changes to classroom situations and classroom setup do we see with the provision of a virtual interpreter?
You know, virtual interpreting should be the absolute last resort. There's no personal connection. You're not in the classroom. They can't see everything. They can't see how the visual materials are being used on the board. They don't have access to that classroom. And the student who has a virtual interpreter, know that they don't have to look. They can just close the laptop and turn away, and they don't have, I mean, if you have to use a virtual interpreter, then I recommend you place virtual interpreters with high school kids, because high school kids, they know how to use an interpreter. They have some personal desire to be able to get through the classes. you know this allows them to develop language skills more generalized across, using various interpreters. I would say last resort. In the past, COVID, you know
No,
ah
they're awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so sometimes technology is like super great, and sometimes technology is not so super great. And when you're a deaf kid and you're trying to acquire information and trying to acquire language, not the best option.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna share our last few screens just so that we can make sure we respect our interpreter's time, who we have here today with us, our interpreter, Miss Terry. Thank you. So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here with us. This was
Thank
amazing
you so
information.
much.
We did.
And thank you, Terry, the interpreter. You did great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. I had a lot of fun. And remember to contact me if you have questions. There's no question that's silly. Everything, I'm open to everything, and I'm going to be very supportive. So please, keep my information and make me a resource.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We did
Thank you. I'm
record
going to
this.
check out. Bye bye. Huh?
We did record this session, so we will see this. You guys will see it next month. We will be talking about listening and spoken language strategies with the Clark's Schools for Hearing and Speech. That'll be March 11th. My friends put in the chat the evaluation. Please put in your feedback. We like to hear what you have to say, and this helps support our project and the need that you guys have for what you need for next school year. And then after you've completed the evaluation, you can then create do your certificate of completion, but do the evaluation first, please. And then you can get your certificate of completion. Whatever you type in is what's going to pop up. So make sure your name is correct, your email's correct, and the title is TA Live Working with an Interpreter. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Terry, for being here, and we'll see y'all next month. Thank you, Jennifer.